All right, so we are recording and we are ready to go. We are in Mark chapter 4 tonight. Um, and we're looking at the next chapter of the Gospels. We're not going to finish. I don't plan to finish the whole chapter tonight. It's a longer chapter. If you've looked at it, we're going to take it about half of it. We're going to get to about around verse 20 or so, and we'll stop for the night. So that's what we're looking at in Mark 4. Now, you remember Mark 3, we talked about Jesus doing his miracles, and he was having some problems with the Pharisees, and he sort of set them in their place. And now Mark sort of takes an interesting spot because this is one of only two chapters in the entire book of Mark of 16 chapters that he devotes purely to teaching. He gives some of Jesus' parables. And again, these parables are ways Jesus taught. In the New Testament, Jesus was the only one who ever used parables to teach. Now, in the Old Testament, some of the prophets would use parables. And we always say that the basic idea of a parable is this an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. And we're going to see tonight that they're very basic, very simple stories that Jesus told that had a deep meaning, that had something that was beyond the eye to understand. And to see these parables, we have to think about them. We have to consider them. We have to ponder them. And Jesus did it this way for a reason. And we'll get to that in just a second. Now, I want you to see what Jesus himself will say about this and why he did what he did. So we start here in verse 1. It says, again, he began to teach beside the sea, and a very large crowd gathered about him, so that he got into a boat and sat in it on the sea. And the whole crowd was beside the sea on the land. And he was teaching them many things in parables. And in his teachings, he said to them, listen. Now, before we get to the parable, that's verse 3. Let's look at these first two verses. Again, Jesus has such a huge crowd. Jesus has this huge following of people who are coming out to hear him, coming out to see what he's about, to see what he can do. And it's very interesting here. This is one of the few places I said a minute ago where Mark doesn't mention Jesus doing miracles. Doesn't talk about Jesus healing the sick. Doesn't talk about him casting out demons. Doesn't kind of talk about any of that other than just teaching. And Jesus is here at the seashore. Remember, he goes to the seashore because you can hear people talk for great distances and easier when you're at a seashore. You're at on a riverbank. If you've ever been camping or went to the walkway at Fulton, you can hear sometimes people across the river talking, not talking loud, but you can hear what they're saying fairly clearly from a great distance. And this is why Jesus does what he does. And so he's on the seashore. He's got the people there. There's so many that he gets into a boat. He gets in a boat, goes a little bit from the seashore, and begins to speak. And the whole crowd listened to him. And then you notice he taught them many things in parables. And again, the parable is the idea of throwing something alongside is the parable meaning, meaning that he gives them a story. And this story has a meaning to it. It's a story that anybody can understand. It's not difficult. It's not rocket science to figure out what this story is about, but it has a deeper meaning to it. And that's what we have to look at. He knows he teaches them what they need to say, what they need to know. And notice he begins in verse 3, listen, behold, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seed fell among the path, and the birds came and ate it and devoured it. Other seed fell on rocky ground, where it did not have much soil, and immediately it sprang up, since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Other seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. And other seeds fell into good soil and produced grain, growing up and increasing and yielding 30-fold and 60-fold and 100-fold. Then he said, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. Now, let's go back before we talk about what this parable means. We'll look at that later. But let's talk about what this parable is about. You notice this parable has been called many things. Some people call it the parable of the sower. It's probably more fitting to call this the parable of the soil. because that's where the seed goes. And he begins to talk about these soils. You notice the sower went out to sow. The idea here is a guy who some people say if they were sitting in depending on what time of year this was, they're sitting on the seaside, these people may look up and some people think that there may have been another hillside that they see this man out here throwing seed on in the various ways, and very well could have been. And what they would have is they'd have a bag with their seed on it. And he would take his hand and he would throw the seed out in the field that he had prepared to grow the seed in. And so just gives that image of a guy out there planting seed, of throwing this seed out. And as he throws it out, he throws it out and it goes everywhere. This is not like planting in like a water or in your garden or planting a flower where you dig a hole and you bury one thing there, you bury the seed in one spot and you make sure you cover it good. This is scattering. This is you're throwing it out and some of it's going to land where it needs to and some of it's not. And that's what happens here. He throws it and some of it lands along the path or along the wayside is what some translations will say. What this is in the ancient times, they didn't necessarily have roads. Not everywhere do they have roads like we do. And so they had paths that people would walk. And sometimes you'd walk through fields to make these paths or maybe in between two fields. And what happens is that if you ever went to the woods, is where we relate to it more than anything, and you see a path that people have walked a lot on, you can see it's beat down. The ground is very hard in that path. Nothing grows in that path, or if it does, it's very little things. That's the idea of the wayside, that these are paths in between the fields because they didn't have fences. They didn't have what we had to keep people out. Their fields will be right there growing on top of each other, and they would have these paths worn out in them. And so he says that some seed fell among this path, this very hard, very stiff ground, and it would hit there, and before it could even try to penetrate, the birds would come. And the birds would come and they would devour the seed. They would eat it before it had a chance to develop, had a chance to get into the seed and just the soil and see what it could do. The second thing that would happen is the other seed, he says, fell on rocky ground. Now, the rocky ground he's talking about here is not a ground necessarily that's covered in rocks that you see above, but it's the rocks you see below. You see in their land and where they lived, just as we sometimes have it today, they had not necessarily a lot of rocks on the surface, but they had rocks underneath. If you think about we talk about another parable that'll talk about this same idea as the wise and the foolish man who built their house. We talk about the wise man built his house upon a rock, and the foolish man built his house on the sand or the ground. The idea is that the foolish man built his house just straight on the ground. The wise man dug down and found rock. And that was typical in their time, that you'd have rock that was hidden beneath the surface if you dig for it. And so this is the ground that the sower is sowing on, is that he's throwing seed on it, and there's rocks beneath the ground. There's a little bit of soil, maybe a foot of soil, or maybe probably less than that, in between the rock and the surface. And what happens is that plant would get into that soil, and it would try to go down. If you've all taken the science classes, you know how seeds work. Their roots try to go down as deep as they can, even little plants. These roots would try to go down, they'd hit the rock. And because they didn't have any depth of soil, because they didn't go down very far, what happens is when the sun comes up, the sun would scorch it. The sun would get so hot, especially in their land where you didn't have a lot of rain, didn't have a lot of clouds, and it would just burn it up. And he says it was scorching, and because it didn't have a root, it would wither away. It's only when it had the root that went down deep. Again, the soil that didn't have the rock could go down deep, and it could survive the sun. Then the third ground is the thorns. The thorns that fell among the thorns, and these thorns were big thorns. They're said to have, I think, 16 types of thorns in the land of Israel. And these thorns would grow up with the seed. And what would happen is that the thorns and the seed would fight over the nutrients in the soil, the nutrients of the sun, the nutrients of the water. And what basically would happen is the thorns would overpower them, being a weed. It would overpower these seed. And again, it would choke it. It would just choke it out where it couldn't grow, and it would cover it up where it couldn't get the light that it needed and the water it needed. And so it would grow, but it would not yield any fruit. Again, notice it grew up, but it didn't yield fruit because the thorns took away what it needed to produce, what it needed to be successful. And then finally, you notice the last one is the good soil. The good soil is the one that was deep, that was rich, there wasn't any thorns, it wasn't a hard spot, and you could grow. And then this soil produced grain. And this grain grew up, it increased. The last one grew up but didn't increase, didn't give anything. This one increased. Not only it increased, notice this, it yielded 30-fold, 60-fold, and 100-fold. What that means is not that one seed yielded 30 pieces of grain, but that they yielded 30,000. Because of one fold of a grain, if you had a good seed of wheat and it was planted in the right soil, it could produce 100 kernels of wheat. And this one says here, Jesus says this created 30 times that. I mean, that's unreal to think about a piece of wheat that produces 30 times what was typical. And then you had not the one that produces 30, but the one that would produce 40, or 60. And then on that, you also had the one that produced 100. And so you see this idea of this this soil being very productive and very important. And then again, he ends this with a saying Jesus likes, and we'll see this in Mark. We'll see it sometimes in Matthew and Luke, and John will use it, and Revelation will use it. He'll use it in Revelation, where he says, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." The ones who are willing to listen. And so Jesus would tell this story, and he would end here. He would talk to these people, and he would tell them many stories like this, but he wouldn't give them the information. He wouldn't explain it to them because he knew that this was a way to test people out. What this story is, or what this anecdote, this parable is that if you ponder it and you want to know what it's about, you're going to read it. You're going to try to figure out and try to understand what this is really teaching. If you're not serious about your religion, if you're not serious about what you're doing, then you're going to be happy to say, okay, I went and heard a great teacher. I went and heard a great man speak, and he told a great story. Or he told a couple of great stories. He entertained me. This is what Jesus is doing. And so Jesus is teaching in this way. He teaches these stories that he's trying to get a message to these people. And eventually we're going to see people start to figure out what these stories are. But in the beginning, they had a hard time with it. And you can understand this. We can understand this when we take away what we see next. And we're just told this story of trying to figure out what it means. Well, the apostles come to Jesus. You notice verse 10. And when he was alone, those around him with the 12 asked him about the parables. And he said to them, to you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God. But for those outside, everything is in parables, so that they may indeed see but not perceive, and may indeed hear but not understand, lest they should turn and be forgiven. So what happens is this is after Jesus taught and after everybody's left, after everybody has departed, and Jesus' disciples are here, his 12 are here, and then there's some more people here, some other disciples like we see in Matthias and some others in Acts 1 that were trying to fill Judas's spot when he died. There were two men put up for that. There were some other men. There's probably some of the women who followed him around, and they come to Jesus and say, well, tell us about the parables. What is the point of the parables? And Jesus tells them, well, for you, you've been given the secrets of the kingdom. For you, you're going to know how things work. You're going to see the inner workings. You're going to be the ones prepared for what's going to happen. And that's what Jesus is doing. He's preparing these disciples, these apostles, for the church. He's preparing them for what's going to happen after he dies. He wants them to know and to be prepared for what is coming. And so he says, you've been given, this select few have been given the ability to know the secret of the kingdom. He says, but for the others, for those who are not trying to seek it, those who are not trying to search it out, to them, everything is told in parables. Jesus said, I'm telling them the truth, but he's not revealing all the intricate details to them. Therefore, he teaches them in these parables. These parables they can figure out if they'll ponder upon them and think about them. But if they don't, then they won't be able to figure these out as easily as other people. And then you notice he says this next, that they may see but not perceive. What he's doing here, he's quoting, Matthew tells us he's quoting Isaiah. which is that they see, but they don't perceive it. They see what Jesus is doing. They see his ability. They see what he's trying to accomplish. They almost understand the truth, but they just don't click. And they hear it, but they don't understand it. And he says this, that they did this lest they should turn and be forgiven. Now, what that means is when you read that, it almost sounds like Jesus doesn't want them to turn and be forgiven. That's not the implication of the words here. The way the Greek and the Hebrew words are for Isaiah is that the only way they can see and perceive, the only way they can hear and understand is if they repent. If they repent and they're forgiven, then they can come and then they'll understand if they try. And that's the idea Jesus is trying to get at, is that they have to be willing to try to figure out what these parables are about and what his kingdom's really about. And so from there, Jesus continues speaking to them. And he says, and he said to them, do you not understand this parable? How then will you understand all the parables? So Jesus starts and says, you don't understand this parable. This very simple, very, very straightforward parable. He said, if you don't understand this parable, then how are you going to understand the others? Now, here's the idea. This is what this parable has been. This parable has been called the father of all parables, the key of parables. And here's what I mean there, is that this thing is revealing to us how we should interpret these parables. Because we read these parables even today, and there are some parables that I have read, and it took me years to figure out, hey, this is what Jesus is saying. And it's almost like that light bulb goes off, and you say, oh, that's what this parable is about. And this is where the disciples were. They heard it, the apostles heard it, but they didn't completely understand it, and they want to understand it. And so what Jesus does is he basically gives them a key. He gives them a way to understand these parables. Now, the thing about the parables is that we have to understand not everything in the parable is to be interpreted. What I mean by that is we don't have to look and see every minor little piece be interpreted and said to mean something. There was one famous writer, I think his name was Jerome, and he wrote about the Good Samaritan parable. And he tried to interpret every little piece of that parable. He tried to tell who the Good Samaritan was. He tried to tell who the man who fell by the wayside was. He told about the Levite, the thieves. He went way out. As a matter of fact, he called the Good Samaritan Paul. And he said the end was the church, and the price was the blood of Christ, and so forth and so on. I forget the other details he gives. And he tries to make every little thing say something. That's not the point of a parable. Not every little point, every word will have a correlating or parallel meaning. Only a major theme. And that's what we need to look for, is what is the major thought, the major idea of this parable. And so Jesus begins to tell us, and he says in verse 14, the sower sows the word. Now, who is the sower? The sower could be various people. The sower is anyone who teaches. In the beginning, the sower is Jesus, because he sows the word. He spreads it out. He throws it out. Anytime we hear someone preach, you want to hear someone teach, they're a sower. When we teach, when we try to help people, when we talk about God to people, we're a sower. We're sowing the word. And when we sow the word, we throw it out there. But one of the things we've got to understand, and this is something you've got to understand in your Christian walk, is that when you try to teach other people, you cannot control how they're going to respond. You just have to put it out there. We're not told that we have to convert so many people. We're not told we have to teach so many people they have to be baptized before we can be a Christian or be a faithful Christian. We're simply told we're to tell. We're to sow the word. We're to spread it. But the sower in the word is not the important part of this parable. Instead, verse 15 tells us about the hearts of men. And notice what it says in verse 15, and these are the ones along the path where the word is sown. When they hear, Satan immediately comes and takes away the word that is sown in them. Now, notice what he says about these people. These people are people who hear the word. They may respond to that word, but their hearts are so hardened, their minds are so closed that they won't accept it. They won't listen. And you're going to find there's going to be some loved ones you may have that you may try to talk to, and they're going to be this soil. They're going to be the ones who just won't do anything with the word, won't let it grow. It just sits on that hard surface. And Satan will come and he'll snatch it away. They'll let Satan take it away and remove it so they don't think about it. They don't ponder it. And if this is what Jesus had to deal with, Jesus is going to deal with these people, then we have to expect that we will deal with these people as well. The second kind of soil is verse 16 and 17. And these are the ones sown on rocky ground, the ones who, when they hear the word, immediately receive it with joy. And they have no root in themselves, but endure for a while. Then, when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately they fall away. The second group is that soil. Remember I told you the rocky ground is that the rocks are underneath the surface and the roots can't go deep enough. There are going to be people that you're going to know. There are going to be people we have to make sure we're not. There are going to be people who are you're going to talk to, you're going to try to teach, you're going to try to get to come to church. And they may come with you. They may be excited about church. They may be happy with church. Notice they hear the word, they receive it, they obey it, they follow it. But then when something comes up that's hard, they fall away. Notice they have no root in themselves. And this is something we have to ask ourselves when we think about our Christian life. And we sometimes as teenagers don't think about our Christian life, but I want you to think about it because we're going to fall in one of these four soils. I don't think any of you are the wayside, but we got to look at these other ones. These are people who they say they're a Christian, they act like a Christian, they talk like Christian, behave like Christian until something comes up, until a hard time comes up. In your situation, it may be that they're put in a spot where they have to decide, okay, am I going to fit in with my group of friends and do what I know is wrong, that's wrong for a Christian to do, or am I going to stand up to them? And there's a lot of people who fall in this category that when something hard comes up, some tribulation, some persecution, something happens that causes them to stand up for their faith. What we talked about Sunday morning of suffering. When they have to suffer for their faith, they fall away. Immediately they fall away. There is no substance to them. There's no lasting ability. And so he says this is the stony ground. Then verse 18, verse 18 and 19, the others are the ones sown among thorns. They are those who hear the word, but the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches and the desire for other things enter in and choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. The last one is the next one is a very, very one to watch out for. These are the ones who hear the word. Again, these are all ones who hear the word, obey the word, and follow the word, but they let something else take them away. The first group, they hear the word, but they don't respond to it. The second group, the rocky ground, they hear the word, but they let hard times take them away. They have no lasting ability. The third group, they can last through tribulation, but their heart is not fully given into God. Their heart is not fully given into what they're doing. The thorns come in. And what are the thorns? Notice what he says in verse 19. The cares of the world, the deceitfulness of riches, and the desire for other things. You're just starting out in your life, but you're going to learn, you probably know now, that there are some people who will do anything to get ahead. There are people who do anything to get a little extra money, to get a little extra fame, to get a little extra popularity, to get a little extra whatever it is they're after, that they want something that's for them. And notice this idea, the riches, the cares of the world, the desire for other things, those are centered upon me. The things I want, things I desire, things that I'm focused on. And the thorns come in, and we have to make a choice sometimes. Now, I'm not saying at all times you have to focus just on God and you can't do anything else, but you have to find a balance, just as most of your parents are trying to find a balance. There's a balance in the idea of, okay, I work to earn a living, I work to have money, but then I also don't work that costs me my soul. I don't give up things that make me miss or doesn't allow me to do Christian activities or be a Christian I'm supposed to be. The same is true of popularity or certain things that we have to give up. Now, we can't be like everybody else. If we do, then the thorns are what's going to choke us. They're going to choke us and be unfruitful. Again, notice this idea. This is one of the telling things to me about this, is it's not that this plant dies, but this plant is unfruitful. This plant doesn't produce what it's supposed to produce. It doesn't shrivel up. It doesn't fall away. It's just a barren weed. That's all it becomes. If a wheat grows up and there's no grain on that wheat, that stem of wheat, then that wheat is worthless. That wheat is a weed. And so the third ground, he says we have to be careful of the thorns. And then lastly, we get to the last ground. But those that are sown on good soil are the ones who hear the word, they accept it, and they bear fruit. And they bear fruit 30-fold, 60-fold, and 100-fold. And what this tells us a few things. Number one, notice that the ones who hear the word. Now, the rest of them have heard the word. But notice this, and they hear the word and they accept it. They hear the word, they accept it, they put it in themselves, and then they produce. They bear fruit. You see, that's one of the telling things about Christians, one of the important things for Christians to do, and that is to make sure we bear fruit. Over and over in the Bible, we're told about those who bear fruit, those who are barren. Those who are barren are constantly said to be not faithful, not truthful, not being the people God's called them to be. But those who are fruitful are the ones God has to be. Well, what does it mean to be fruitful? What does it mean to bear fruit? It means a few things. Number one, it means our lifestyle is going to produce fruit. Our lifestyle is going to produce the Galatians 5:22 and 23, the fruit of the Spirit. The love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Those are things we're going to produce. We're going to have a life that has love, a life that has peace and patience and all those fruit. But it's also going to be a life that produces more people. And that may be scary to us. And that we may say, oh, well, I don't like that. Well, I understand that. I understand not wanting to be it, but we have to be that. We have to be willing to tell people. Now, it's not necessarily that we have to worry about people listening to us, but we have to be willing to tell them why we believe what we believe. We have to be willing to teach others. And again, when I say teach others, that doesn't mean that you have to sit down one-on-one and do a Bible study. But you have friends, you have people that you can talk to about being a Christian. When they have a question, you can sit down and have them talk with somebody else. They can talk with your parents. They can talk with your grandparents. They can talk with me, with anybody here at church. And that's the idea that we try to bring people to God. And again, when we bring them in, we're bearing fruit. Now, what happens to that fruit? Well, we don't know. Because again, they're going to fall right the same way. But when you look at these four soils, and what we want to be is we want to be the ones who are producing fruit, who are showing others Christ in what we teach, and what we do, and what we say, and are bringing people to him. They see us stand out. We don't let the cares of this world, we don't let the worries of this world choke us out. We don't let those stop us from being the Christian and the person God has called us to be. And so Jesus says, this is the first parable. This is the parable that you can understand. Again, this is one of the only parables that Jesus lays it out and says, here's what the parable really means. We're actually going, I know we're a little earlier than usual, but I want to stop right here because I don't want to get too much tonight. It's already 8 o'clock. So we're going to stop right there tonight. Does anybody got a question or comment about this first parable and Jesus talking about this? All right, if not, we're going to stop our recording. I appreciate everyone being here tonight. Remember, next Monday night, we'll be back at 7:30, and we'll pick up here in verse 20. So appreciate y'all being here. We hope to see you all next Monday night. For those who are online, stay online just a minute. Let me finish this recording, and we'll talk about something. But appreciate those who have watched us later. And again, we hope you're having a good week, and we hope to talk to you again soon.